There is something quietly haunting about the glittering world of Europe's Belle Époque. From the outside, it shimmered with chandeliers, lace, and laughter. But beneath the surface of silk gowns and gold-tipped canes, another world was breathing, slowly, dreamily, dangerously. It was the world of Morphine. It began, as so many things in that age did, with progress. Science, medicine, and invention were worshipped like new gods, and the syringe was their sacred tool. In the late 19th century, morphine was hailed as a miracle, a drop of clear liquid that could silence pain, calm nerves, and soothe sleepless nights. Doctors prescribed it freely, to soldiers wounded by shrapnel, to mothers weary from childbirth, and most especially, to the women of Europe's upper class, whose ailments were rarely physical but often deeply emotional. Society women had delicate constitutions, or so the physicians said. They suffered from nerves, melancholy, or female hysteria. They were told that their minds were too fine, too sensitive for the harsh world around them. So, in their mahogany dressing tables, among the perfume bottles and silver combs, nestled the tiny glass vials that promised serenity. Morphine, in elegant doses, became the invisible companion of the European elite. In Paris, the salons glowed with champagne laughter and soft music. But behind the curtains, many of those glittering guests carried small syringes in embroidered pouches. The countesses, the duchesses, and the heiresses who smiled through long dinners and charity balls were often gently floating, untethered, detached, serene. The morphine bride was a creature of contradiction, outwardly radiant, inwardly drifting through the fog of oblivion. No one wanted to speak of addiction. The word itself was indecent. It belonged to the alleys and brothels, not to women who wore pearls and painted fans. Yet by the 1890s, Europe's most refined drawing rooms were filled with quiet suffering. The symptoms were subtle: a growing lethargy, a faint tremor, a tendency to sleep through the afternoon. The faces remained beautiful, but the eyes, those eyes, seemed to look somewhere else, as if the world had blurred into a dream they could no longer leave. Doctors were complicit, of course. Many were proud of their discreet clientele. In London's Mayfair, physicians made home visits under the pretense of treating insomnia or migraines. In Vienna, Sigmund Freud himself experimented with narcotics, searching for cures to the restless mind. And in Paris, where fashion and medicine often intertwined, morphine became an accessory, a whisper of modernity and control. Women who used it were not seen as fallen, but as fragile, artistic, even romantic. There was a strange poetry to the addiction. In letters and diaries, women described their injections not as medical necessity, but as ritual, a private sacrament. The needle slid beneath the skin, the chill of the liquid spreading through the veins, and then the quiet peace, the sweet detachment from all anxiety and expectation. The morphine did not just dull pain, it dissolved time. For the aristocratic women of Belle Époque Europe, time itself was often the enemy. Days were long and unchanging, filled with social obligations that masked deep isolation. Husbands were absent or indifferent, lovers unfaithful, and the rigid etiquette of high society left little room for genuine emotion. The morphine bottle became a secret friend, the only one who never judged, never demanded, never left. In the grand hotels of the Riviera, ladies carried their medicine in jeweled cases. On trains bound for Vienna or Milan, they dozed themselves discreetly behind lace curtains, and in their country estates, they retreated into a world of sleep and reverie. The sound of the sea, the scent of lavender, the hush of morphine, all blurred into one endless twilight. Some of these women were artists and patrons, muses of painters and poets who adored their pale serenity. To them, the morphine bride was a symbol of modern beauty, delicate, languid, tragic. Lautrec painted them in dim cafes. Writers like Colette and Prost caught glimpses of their haunted grace. But the truth behind the image was much darker. For every glamorous portrait, there were countless nights of withdrawal, confusion, and despair. The body began to rebel long before the spirit admitted defeat. Shaking hands, sunken eyes, the constant ache that only another injection could relieve. Yet, even as their health declined, many women clung to their routines. They called it my little comfort, the drop of sleep, the kindness of God. To give it up would be to face the unbearable clarity of life once more, the boredom, the loneliness, the expectations. The newspapers rarely mentioned such things. Addiction among women of rank was a scandal too delicate to print. Instead, gossip moved quietly through servants' quarters and hospital corridors. A countess found unconscious in her bath. A young bride who could not wake after her wedding night. A duchess whose luggage contained more vials than jewels. But no names were published, and the world continued to dance. In cities like Vienna, Berlin, and Paris, morphine use spread beyond the aristocracy. Artists, writers, musicians, all drawn to the same dreamlike release, joined what was becoming a hidden epidemic. But it was among women of wealth that the habit found its most tragic poetry. They were prisoners in their palaces, floating between pleasure and ruin, unable to live without the very thing that was slowly erasing them. By the turn of the century, the tone began to shift. Doctors started to recognize dependence. Newspapers whispered of a morphine curse, and governments tried to regulate its sale. Yet for many women, it was too late. Their lives were built around the drug. Their friendships revolved around shared secrecy. In private salons, they compared doses and discussed doctors who were most understanding. Some even hosted afternoon gatherings where morphine was served with tea, a ritual as elegant as it was devastating. The war would change everything. When 1914 arrived and Europe collapsed into chaos, morphine became a different kind of medicine again, used in the trenches, in field hospitals, in the desperate hours before death. For a time, the genteel addiction of the Belle Époque seemed almost innocent compared to the horrors that followed. The morphine brides grew older, their world of velvet and lace dissolving in the smoke of war. Some survived into the 1920s, ghosts of a vanished age. They wandered through Paris hotels or Italian spas, still elegant, still searching for peace in their glass syringes. But the world no longer looked at them with envy. The new age worshipped vitality, jazz and speed. The pale dreamers of the Belle Époque seemed like relics from a forgotten dream. And yet their story lingers. In faded photographs, you can still see them. The gloved hands resting on embroidered armchairs, the slight curve of a smile that hides exhaustion, the eyes that seem to look inward rather than out. Theirs was not a story of scandal, but of sorrow, in a world that prized beauty and restraint. They sought freedom in the only place it was offered, in the soft oblivion of morphine. Perhaps they were not so different from others who have turned to substances for solace. Theirs was an era of appearances, where emotion was forbidden and performance constant. Morphine gave them permission to feel nothing, to be nothing, to drift beyond the reach of gossip or expectation. It became their rebellion, quiet, invisible, fatal. The Belle Époque ended, as all ages of beauty do, in dust and silence. The chandeliers dimmed, the ballrooms emptied, and the last morphine brides slipped away, their stories buried beneath the polite archives of history. But in the hush between then and now, if you listen closely, you might still sense them. The soft rustle of silk, the faint click of glass, the sigh of a woman surrendering to sleep. Because in the end, that was all they ever wanted: rest. In the heart of Paris, where gaslights glimmered on rain, washed boulevards and carriage wheels murmured softly over cobblestones. Countess Elodie de Saint Clair lived in a mansion that seemed perpetually bathed in half-light. The house stood near the Parc Monceau, behind gates wrought like lace, with ivy crawling up its pale stone façade. By day, it looked like every other aristocratic home of the Belle Époque, its windows polished, its staff discreet, its silence absolute. But by night, when the city breathed more slowly, there was a faint music drifting from her window. a piano playing scales that never quite found their melody. Elodie was 32, though she had the ageless face of a woman, untouched by the ordinary burdens of life. Her complexion was porcelain, her eyes grey and heavy, lidded, her movements slow, deliberate as though each gesture had been rehearsed. Paris adored her still. In the salons of the Faubourg Saint-Germain, her name was spoken like a sigh. Countess St. Clair, the most graceful widow in the city, the woman whose beauty seemed woven from sleep itself. No one knew how much she slept, or how deeply. Once, years ago, Elodie had been lively. The daughter of a diplomat, she had grown up between Vienna and Paris, her childhood filled with languages, music, and endless travel. She had married at 20 to a man twice her age, a count with an impeccable title and a vast estate. The newspapers had called it a perfect union of elegance and influence. But it was a cold marriage, polite and distant. Her husband was fond of her in the way a collector is fond of a painting. He placed her among his possessions and expected her to remain still. She learned early that silence was a kind of survival. The turning point came quietly, as all great shifts in her life did. It began with a doctor's visit. Her pulse irregular, her sleep broken. She was told she was overwrought, suffering from nerves, the vague diagnosis reserved for women who felt too much or too little. The physician, with impeccable manners and a polished accent, offered her a remedy, a small vial, clear as crystal, and a fine silver syringe. Just a drop, he said, for calm, and it worked. The first time she injected the liquid, she felt a cool serenity descend upon her. The anxious flutter of her heart slowed, the thoughts that tangled in her mind smoothed into stillness. It was not joy exactly, but a release from the weight of being. The chandeliers seemed to glow more softly, her breathing deepened, and she drifted, as though she were floating in warm water. The world grew hushed and bearable. At first, she used it sparingly, a few drops on nights when the emptiness grew heavy, or when the echo of her husband's absence filled the corridors. But the calm she found in those moments became the calm she began to crave. By the end of that first winter, morphine had taken root in her life like ivy, graceful, silent, unrelenting. In the mirror, she still looked perfect. The world saw no difference. But inside, time began to lose its edges. Days blurred into one another, her sense of morning and night dissolved. She wrote in her diary, she played the piano, and always, at the heart of it, she injected her small ritual of escape. Her maid, Claudine, noticed first. The Countess had begun to skip meals, to sleep late into the afternoon, to forget appointments. When guests came to call, she received them from her couch, her voice gentle but distant. Some whispered that grief had made her fragile, others, less kind, said that she fancied herself an invalid to avoid the tiresome obligations of society. No one suspected the truth, that beneath the lace sleeve of her dressing gown, the inside of her arm was traced with faint marks, as delicate as the veins of a leaf. Spring came, and Paris glittered. The Exposition Universelle was underway. The city buzzed with optimism. But Elodie drifted through it all like a ghost. The parties she attended were quieter now, the music softer. She smiled politely, her laughter slow and delayed, as though coming from somewhere far away. Men still admired her, women still envied her, and her doctors still called her delicately inclined. In the mirror, she began to resemble the portraits that lined her salon, paintings of ancestors whose gazes seemed fixed on something invisible. She found comfort in routine. Every evening, as the lamplighters passed beneath her window, she would sit at her vanity. The ritual was sacred. The perfume bottle to her left, the glass vial to her right, the needle gleaming faintly in the dim light. She would draw in the liquid, steady her breath, and press the needle to her skin. The moment it entered, she felt the world sigh and release her. It was not euphoria, it was absence, a quiet surrender of self. Sometimes she would imagine herself dissolving, becoming part of the silk drapery, the wallpaper, the faint perfume in the air. Nothing hurt, nothing demanded, nothing existed beyond the stillness. But morphine, like love and time, is never content to remain gentle. The doses that once calmed her began to fade too quickly. The serenity she sought slipped through her fingers, forcing her to chase it more often, more desperately. She told herself it was temporary, that she would stop once her nerves were better, once her heart grew steadier. But the promise of later is the sweetest lie the drug whispers. By the second year, she rarely left her home. The piano gathered dust. The Countess wrote long letters to friends she never sent. In one, never posted, she confessed, "I live between waking and dreaming. The days are pale mirrors, and I am the reflection that forgets to move." Her servants grew used to the quiet rhythm of her life. Claudine prepared trays of untouched breakfast, carried away books half-read, folded gowns never worn. Visitors dwindled. Those who did come found her reclining in soft light, her hands resting lightly on a blanket, her voice slow and hypnotic. There was something magnetic about her fragility. She seemed less a woman than a vision, a painting that breathed. Doctors continued to visit. They spoke in gentle tones, adjusted her prescriptions, and left reassured by her composure. None dared to challenge her habits. It was not their place to tell a countess what to do in her own home. And she, in turn, thanked them sweetly, promising to rest, to eat, to take fresh air. The moment the door closed, she reached for the syringe again. There were nights when the morphine failed her, when the peace she sought refused to come. Those nights were the worst. Her body trembled, her mind turned feverish. Shadows in the corners of her room seemed to breathe. She would pace the floor barefoot, whispering to herself that it would pass. And it did, eventually, when she returned to the vial, and the needle kissed her skin once more. Outside, Paris changed. New fashions, new faces, new scandals. But inside the St. Clair mansion, time stood still. The clocks ticked softly, ignored. The garden grew wild, the servants older. The Countess existed in a suspended twilight, neither ill nor well, alive but half asleep. Occasionally, she received letters from friends traveling abroad. Invitations to the Riviera, to Venice, to winter in Nice. She would trace the handwriting with her fingers, smile faintly, and return the envelope unopened to her desk. The world beyond her walls had grown distant, unreal. One autumn, when the trees in the Parc Monceau burned golden red, Elodie attempted to stop. For 3 days she tried. The pain that came was unlike anything she had known. Her body rebelled, her heart raced, her vision blurred. The peace she had bought so easily was gone, replaced by panic and despair. Claudine found her trembling, her hands clenched, her lips murmuring prayers she could no longer finish. The doctor was summoned, and when he arrived, he said gently, "Madame needs her rest." He administered a dose himself. After that, she never tried again. In those final years, her world became smaller still. She rarely spoke, but when she did, her voice carried a strange serenity. Guests sometimes remarked that she seemed almost holy, like a saint in retreat. She read poetry aloud in the evenings, to herself mostly, and often fell asleep mid-verse, the book slipping from her fingers. The newspapers never mentioned her decline. To society, she remained a symbol of grace and composure. Her portraits were displayed in galleries, her name whispered with reverence. No one spoke of the quiet tragedy unfolding behind her iron gates. On a winter morning in 1903, Claudine found her mistress in the same chair where she always sat, her hand resting on her lap, her face calm. The fire had gone out hours earlier. The morphine vial beside her was empty. Paris, that restless city of beauty and forgetting, did what it always did. It moved on. Her funeral was small, discreet, attended by those who loved her name more than her soul. The priest spoke of peace, of eternal rest, and in that, perhaps, he was right. In the years that followed, her mansion was sold, her possessions scattered. The piano remained in storage for decades, its keys yellowing with dust. Sometimes, when a servant spoke of her, they used a tone of awe, not pity. She was like a dream, they said, and perhaps she was. For the story of Countess Élodie de Saint Clair is not one of scandal, nor even of addiction. It is a story of silence, of a woman who lived in a world that prized composure above all, and who found, in the soft whisper of a syringe, the only space where she could simply exist without being observed. Her tragedy was not that she died from morphine, but that she lived for it. In that gentle oblivion, she found what the world refused to give her: freedom without consequence, peace without judgment, love without demand. And so she drifted, until she became the thing she most desired: stillness. Even now, when night falls over Paris and the rain begins to trace the same glass windows she once looked through, there is a sense of her presence. In the hush of the streets, in the echo of distant music, in the perfume that lingers after a dream fades. Countess Élodie de Saint Clair, the first of the Morphine brides, sleeps still in history's quietest corner, where pain and pleasure are indistinguishable, and the soul finally rests. They used to call it the Age of Light. The cafes of Paris gleamed with brass and mirrors. Vienna's waltzes drifted through palatial halls. London spoke of progress and grace. But beneath the shimmer of chandeliers, another light burned quietly. The bluish flicker of morphine lamps, a softer, secret flame. It was a light not of joy, but of surrender. And through it, Europe's most elegant women slipped into their own private heavens, one trembling breath at a time. No one noticed when the transformation began. It was always so gentle. A sleepless night here, a migraine there, a prescription written with delicate care by a trusted physician, its vial wrapped in white linen, tied with gold string. Just a little to ease the nerves, they would say, and thus began a story that would weave through parlors and palaces, through curtained boudoirs and perfumed carriages, through centuries of inherited restraint. At first, there was only relief, that soft, dreamlike stillness where thought dissolved into silk. Morphine was not the kind of pleasure that demanded, it whispered. It folded itself around grief, around boredom, around the unspoken weight of expectations. To the women of the Belle Époque, women painted, polished, and imprisoned in etiquette, it offered the most forbidden luxury of all: forgetfulness. In London, a widow might lie perfectly still upon her chaise, surrounded by the pale light of dawn, her face so serene that even her servants believed her healed. But within her veins, the narcotic sea was already rising. She floated upon it like a saint adrift, detached from sorrow and time alike. In Vienna, a pianist might rest her trembling hands upon the keys, playing only a single note that trembled endlessly in the air. The morphine steadied her fingers, yes, but it also stole her soul note by note. The powder, white empire of addiction did not roar, it sighed. It crept gently into lace and satin, into every hush of refinement. In the salons of Paris, morphine was served with the same discretion as champagne. Its devotees smiled with impeccable grace, their eyes shining a little too brightly beneath the gaslight. They were admired for their composure, their delicate paleness, their poetic melancholy. No one called it illness. They called it style. There was a strange kind of holiness in their decline. The morphine brides were not rebels, not courtesans, not sinners in the vulgar sense. They were instead the purest embodiment of their time, women too refined to scream, too educated to despair, too proud to admit need. And so, they turned inward. They let the liquid peace enter them drop by drop, until their thoughts became slow rivers, and their fears melted like candle wax. Each had her own ritual. Some preferred the hush of their dressing rooms, mirrors covered with gauze, so that they would not have to watch the changing of their faces. Others chose their carriages, rocking gently through the boulevards as the drug hummed softly in their veins. A few dared to indulge at the opera, concealed behind fans and jewels. The syringe was as much a part of the wardrobe as gloves or pearls. Time began to lose meaning. Days became gauze-like, translucent, indistinguishable. In their diaries, those careful records of noble women's thoughts, the handwriting changed. Lines became slower, rounder, fading into illegibility. Thoughts no longer concluded, they drifted. The Morphine bride lived in perpetual twilight, between dream and waking, between consciousness and the slow seduction of oblivion. Society continued to dance. The Belle Époque glittered on, cabarets, Art Nouveau, inventions, electricity. But in its drawing rooms something ghostly lingered. Husbands whispered to doctors. Doctors whispered to one another. "It is epidemic," one said. But such a polite one. The doctors were not cruel, they were complicit. They believed themselves healers, offering solace to women too delicate for the roughness of the modern world. They spoke of hysteria, of exhaustion, of feminine fragility, a myth that allowed them to medicate without guilt. And the women accepted it, because it suited the story they had always been told, that they were meant to be beautiful, gentle, and quiet, even in their suffering. In Paris, Countess Elodie once remarked, "Morphine is my husband now." It was meant as a jest, but behind it lay a truth shared by many. The drug became their only constant companion, their invisible confidant. When lovers betrayed, when husbands ignored, when age crept in, Morphine remained faithful. It did not question, it did not demand. It only asked for more of the same, and so Europe's boudoirs became shrines to silence. Perfume mixed with the faint, metallic scent of medicine. The golden frames of mirrors caught the faint tremor of candlelight. Outside, the streets sang with progress. The click of wheels, the hiss of trains, the shouts of vendors, but inside, time slowed until it ceased entirely. The Morphine bride did not grow old. She lingered in a state of permanent almostness. Almost awake, almost alive, almost happy. Her face remained smooth not because of youth, but because of stillness. Her voice grew softer, her laughter rarer. She was admired for her tranquility, not pitied for her dependence. The world called her graceful. Only her veins told the truth. In Vienna, where waltzes once spun endlessly through crystal halls, the Morphine brides moved slower. Their gowns rustled like ghost wings. The empire itself seemed to inhale their torpor, that golden lethargy before decline. Morphine had seeped beyond the salons into the bloodstream of civilization. It dulled not just pain, but memory. It softened ambition, tamed despair, turned history into a dream. And yet, beneath all that beauty, something quietly rotted. The syringes grew more frequent, the doses stronger. Some began to bruise, to forget, to tremble. Servants whispered of accidents, a fall down the stairs, a fainting fit, a fever that never quite left. The word addiction was never spoken aloud. It was unthinkable that a duchess, a countess, a baroness could succumb to such a vulgar thing. No, she was simply all delicate, overwrought. The language of denial was elegant, and it killed gently. The Morphine brides did not die dramatically. They faded, one by one. They vanished from society's gaze. A retreat to the countryside. A period of rest abroad. Letters went unanswered, invitations declined. Their portraits remained on the walls, still radiant, still eternal, while their bodies dwindled in darkened rooms. And when they passed, they were remembered not as addicts, but as tragic beauties, victims of their own refinement. In the newspapers, the world continued to modernize. Cars began to replace carriages. Telephones sang. Airplanes rose into the sky. But beneath it all, the quiet epidemic of morphine remained, not just among the poor, not in the hospitals, but in the hearts of Europe's most admired women. Their addiction was not only chemical, it was spiritual. It was the addiction to escape from the narrow cage of gender, of expectation, of civilization itself. For a moment, it seemed that the whole age might float away with them. An entire society anesthetized by its own elegance. The more the Morphine brides withdrew, the more their world glittered, desperate to hide the decay beneath. Painters painted brighter colors. Poets wrote of light. But behind every canvas, behind every line, the shadow pulsed a thin, silver needle gleaming in lamplight. And so the Morphine brides became myth. Their faces lingered in the memory of Europe like the scent of faded perfume, familiar, melancholy, and almost sweet. They were the ghosts of an era that could not bear its own consciousness. When the Great War finally came, many of them were already gone. Those who remained watched the world erupt in fire, and for the first time, the rest of humanity sought what they had known all along: the desire not to feel. Morphine had been their escape, but it had also been prophecy. What began in drawing rooms ended in trenches. The same calm oblivion that had soothed aristocrats now numbed soldiers. The same glass ampoules once hidden in silk boxes now clinked in medical kits. The addiction that had once been elegant became universal. The Morphine brides were forgotten, but not erased. Their legacy lingered in every whispered prescription, every sleepless night soothed by a pill. They had been the first to surrender, to admit, silently, beautifully, that the modern world was too sharp for fragile hearts. And though the Belle d'Époque has long since ended, their story never truly did, because the longing that drew them toward that soft, merciful oblivion, the wish to quiet the noise, to dissolve the ache, to drift beyond the edge of pain, still breathes quietly in every age that follows. It is the same longing that lies hidden behind so many masks of grace. The chandeliers of Paris have dimmed, the waltzes of Vienna have faded, but somewhere, in the deep sleep of history, the Morphine brides still dream, their hands folded, their pulses faint, their beauty undisturbed. In their dreams, time is kind, suffering is distant, the world is soft again, and as the night stretches across Europe, their ghosts drift quietly through its corridors, not in shame, not in sin, but in eternal, narcotic. The years drifted softly over Europe, like lace settling on forgotten furniture. The world outside changed its shape, streets grew louder, machines multiplied. The future began to whisper through wires and steel. Yet behind the tall windows of the old aristocratic houses, the light remained the same, pale, golden, and slightly sickly, as though it had not moved in years. It was within these quiet rooms, filled with perfume and melancholy, that the Morphine brides still lived, or rather, lingered. They were no longer the talk of society, for society itself had grown tired of whispers. New scandals replaced the old ones, and the world grew too busy to remember its fallen beauties. But in their silence, in their stillness, they remained perfect relics of the century's fatigue. They were, each of them, a monument to longing, not for love, not for glory, but for rest. In one such house, overlooking the faintly blue Seine, a woman named Celeste once ruled the world of Paris fashion. Her atelier had been a temple of beauty, her hands quick as light, her smile a currency more powerful than money. But now the mirrors were covered, the mannequins draped in sheets. Only one lamp burned each night beside her, its glow steady as the pulse beneath her skin. The Morphine, once an indulgence taken for inspiration, had become her entire rhythm. She did not dream anymore. Dreams belonged to those who feared waking. Celeste had long since crossed that threshold, into a life where waking and sleeping were the same. She would sit for hours beside the open window, watching the city shimmer and blur. Somewhere below, the carriages rolled, the cafes sparkled, and the poets sang their decadence. But she had already said everything beauty could say. All that remained was the silence after applause, and the needle that turned that silence into peace. The Belle d'Époque was nearing its end. The signs were subtle, like cracks beneath paint. Empires still glittered, but the glitter had the wary shimmer of exhaustion. The Grand Duchesses of St. Petersburg still waltzed. The ladies of London still dined beneath chandeliers. But the air was growing heavy. In every ballroom, there was a sense that the music was playing too fast, as if to keep away the dark. And within that growing unease, the Morphine brides floated like pale ghosts of the century's conscience. They had once been symbols of elegance, and now they were its casualties. Their beauty no longer dazzled, it haunted. Their silence, once graceful, now seemed like a warning. It was said that in Vienna, a pianist had gone blind from the drug, yet continued to perform by memory, her fingers gliding across the keys as if they still saw. Her audiences wept for the purity of her expression, never knowing that she was not feeling the music at all, only the slow, liquid calm coursing through her. The critics called her a genius of restraint, a master of subtle emotion. Only she knew that she was playing nothing, that her heart had stopped keeping time long ago. Elsewhere, in London, a widow named Constance still kept her husband's study untouched. Each night, she would unlock the drawer where the little glass vials lay hidden. The same hand that once signed charity checks now trembled slightly as it held the syringe. She would look out the window toward the garden, where the roses were long dead, and think that it was good they could not see her. She did not believe in redemption anymore, but she believed in stillness, and stillness, at least, was something Morphine always gave. In Paris, another woman, a painter's muse named Isolde, drifted through her attic room. Her portraits hung in galleries now, celebrated as the very image of Parisian allure. But no one knew that the real Isolde was gone. The girl who had once laughed beneath the moonlight of Montmartre, replaced by a creature of smoke and shadow. Her reflection in the mirror no longer moved when she did. Sometimes she forgot which of them was real. The morphine had turned her into a masterpiece without an artist, a dream without a dreamer. Across Europe, they were connected not by friendship or blood, but by silence. They were like constellations, each star shining faintly on its own, but part of the same invisible pattern. A duchess in Monaco, a singer in Naples, a perfumer in Grasse, all drawn together by the same sweet oblivion, and somewhere among them, always unseen, moved the doctors. They were the high priests of this quiet faith, prescribing peace, administering grace, and taking careful notes in leather-bound books. One such doctor, Augustin Noyer, had treated women across 3 countries. He never asked questions. His prescriptions were written in an elegant, untroubled hand. He believed himself merciful. But sometimes, as he packed his case at the end of the night, he would notice the faint perfume of despair that clung to his sleeves. He knew that morphine was no longer a medicine, it was an inheritance, passed down like jewelry, like etiquette, from mother to daughter. Every new generation of women learned it differently. In the 1870s, it had been fashionable. In the 1880s, respectable. By the 1890s, it was quietly necessary. And now, in the new century, it had become invisible. The hidden pulse of modern femininity. There were whispers in Parisian circles about the white sleep. It was said that women who took it never aged. Their faces remained smooth, their tempers serene. They did not suffer, did not weep. They were, in short, perfect. What no one saw was that perfection is simply another word for paralysis. The morphine brides did not feel pain because they did not feel anything at all. Outside, the world was rushing forward. Trains screamed across borders. Telephones shrieked with strange new voices. The first airplanes trembled through the sky. The men of Europe looked upward, toward the future. The women looked downward, toward the needle. The 2 directions would meet soon enough. In the trenches, in the hospitals, in the endless nights of waiting. But that time had not yet come. For now, the morphine brides still drifted through their golden prisons. Their gowns rustled like sighs. Their laughter echoed faintly through marble halls. Their letters, if they wrote them at all, were filled with abstractions. About light, about silence, about the peculiar sweetness of surrender. The world thought them poetic. They were simply lost. There was a kind of beauty in their decline, though it was not the beauty they had sought. It was the beauty of autumn, the loveliness of things just before they fade. Morphine had made them eternal, but only in the way statues are eternal, motionless, unfeeling, slowly crumbling beneath the dust. Sometimes, at night, they dreamed of the world before, the laughter of their youth, the scent of flowers, the sound of rain. But even in dreams, the memories came faintly, like postcards from a vanished country. They no longer belonged to the world of the living. They were brides not of men, not even of Morphine itself, but of the century's exhaustion. The Belle Époque had promised them paradise, but had delivered only performance. They had been daughters, wives, ornaments, muses, but never selves. Morphine had given them what the world would not: a private kingdom, an empire of quiet where they could exist without demand or judgment. And yet, that kingdom was shrinking. Each dose brought them closer to a border they could not see. They were not afraid of it. Fear, too, had been dissolved. What waited beyond was not death, but a continuation of silence. The newspapers would one day call it a tragic epidemic. The doctors would blame hysteria. The husbands would shake their heads and speak of fragile hearts. But the truth was simpler and crueler. They had been born into a world that demanded perfection, and morphine had been the only way to survive it. As the century turned and the lights of Europe grew brighter, their shadows deepened. The morphine brides began to disappear altogether, one by one, without farewell. Their houses were sold, their portraits auctioned, their diaries forgotten in drawers. But sometimes, late at night, the faint scent of violets or ether still lingered in those rooms, as if the air itself remembered their dreams. History would go on to celebrate other women: the suffragettes, the reformers, the writers. The morphine brides were erased, deemed too passive, too tragic, too inconvenient for progress. But they had lived the truest version of their time. They had carried its unbearable grace to its quiet conclusion. And somewhere, beyond the reach of memory, they are still there, in the endless twilight of morphine's mercy, where the mind is a soft blue horizon and the body no longer aches. They float through corridors that have no doors, whispering to one another in voices made of silk and smoke. It is peaceful there. Time does not pass. Sorrow does not return. The world outside may roar and burn, but in that still, white sleep, nothing changes. The morphine brides rest eternally, the last, fragile saints of an age that mistook numbness for beauty and silence for salvation.